More options with GIMP and Photoshop. In this overview, I'll talk about copy options, brush options, and touch-up options. You may have noticed a couple of pictures of Stirling Castle in Scotland. This will become part of my demonstration later. In GIMP, I'd like to talk about the plain copy-paste option, which leads to different options for pasting as a new layer. I'll also talk a little bit about the scissors tool and the clone tool. I've opened up a photograph of myself at Stirling Castle. I'm going to choose the rectangular selection tool, put a rectangular selection around myself, choose Edit, Copy, and then choose Edit, Paste. You'll notice it created a floating selection. It's a pasted layer. If I choose my Move tool, I can move that selection and make myself a twin. But there's other paste options. The problem with this copy-paste is it leads to a floating layer. That floating layer can be moved, but then it must be anchored into the existing layer, which would not be a good idea because you can no longer edit them separately, or it could be converted into a permanent layer. Let me demonstrate back in GIMP. If I choose Anchor Layer, I now have one layer, and if I was to use the eraser tool to get rid of some of these artifacts, it erases to white. Let's try it as converting it to a permanent layer. I've reset it back to the way it was. I still have a floating layer. This time, I'll right-click and choose to New Layer. Now if I choose my Move tool, I can still move this around independently of the original image. And if I choose my eraser, making sure that layer is selected, I can erase the top layer, revealing the base image. I could also have chosen Paste Into Current Selection. I've selected and copied. I'll draw a new selection area and choose Edit, Paste Into to paste it into the new selection area. Again, this gives me a floating selection layer, which I'll have to deal with later. I could also have chosen Paste As. Again, my rectangular selection area. This time, choose Paste As. I could just create a new separate image, or I can go directly to New Layer. Using the Move tool, I can now reposition that image. This is my method of choice, unless I'm doing something with the scissors tool. When using the scissors tool, you have to paste into a floating area. Let me demonstrate that. There's my base image. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm working on. I'll choose the scissors tool. This tries to select around the areas that I'm outlining by playing a game of connect the dots. Try to do as good a job as you can and add perhaps more dots than I am. When you have selected the entire area, click in the middle to make the active selection. Choose Edit, Copy Visible, and then choose Edit, Paste. I now have this floating selection layer. I can use my Move tool and start with an image that doesn't have a lot of the clutter that came with the other. You'll notice I cut off parts of my head. So let me show you one more way to do this to get perhaps a little bit more control than the dots would allow. I'm back to my base image. Again, I'm just going to quickly use the scissors tool. Notice I'm being less selective than I was before. click on the selection. You'll notice it did not get part of my foot. Using the selection tool, I can add to that selection. Again, edit, copy, edit, paste, select the floating layer, and use the Move tool. One of my favorite things is rather than trying to select very complex shapes, is sometimes I'll simply clone an area. Back in GIMP, choose the Clone tool. That brush is a little too small. So down here, I'll make sure that it's a hard brush, but I'm going to increase the size. I think that will work. Point where you want to start cloning, press the Control key and click. But this free floating tool is where it will paste to. I'm basically copy pasting with a brush. So now I'll click and start cloning the selected area on the left. One of the big problems with cloning is it stays in the same layer, so if you make a mistake, it's a little harder to deal with. Let me try it a slightly different way. Go to Layer, New Layer, and make sure it's transparent. Select the original layer, hold down the Control key, and reset your copy from point. Then choose the new layer and paste into the new layer. That could be a little more deliberate, but again, I think you get the idea. And then, selecting the new layer and the eraser tool, you can erase the parts that you don't need. Let's try this in Photoshop now. I've opened the same image in Photoshop. And again, you can use the rectangular selection tool. Edit, copy, edit, paste. We don't have as many options, but we don't need any. Because in Photoshop, it always creates a new layer. And using the Move tool, we can simply move it and not worry about any floating layers or anchoring. Again, we could choose the eraser tool and erase down to get rid of some of the artifacts from the copy process. I've reset my image. Let's talk about some of the different options that are similar to the scissors tool. The polygonal lasso tool will let me copy by clicking connect the dots fashion, just as we did before. You notice that it is not clinging to the image. So instead, you might try using the magnetic lasso tool. Again, let me zoom in just a little bit. Using the magnetic selection tool, I'm just going across the outside, and just as I move my mouse around, I can click to make some selection points, but it's also able to create its own selection points as I go. I just think it works better if you are actively participating in choosing the selection as you go. Again, if you've missed part of it, choose the elliptical selection tool, hold down your Shift key, and perhaps add to that selection. Cloning in Photoshop. I've reset my image back to normal, and I'm going to choose the Clone Stamp tool. While we use the Control key in GIMP, we use the Alt key to set our target. Again, if my brush is too big, I can change that, but this will work for the time being. Again, one of the problems with cloning is if you're working in one layer, you can't go back and correct anything. I've reset my image. I choose Layer, New Layer, No Color, Transparent. Again, Alt to set my target, switch to the new layer, and clone into the new layer. That way, we can take the eraser tool and erase some of the problems that we cloned over. Let's talk again about the brush options. In GIMP, when you select a tool, you can choose the hardness of the brush. You can choose the size of the brush, whether it's the pencil tool for hard, thin edges. You can modify it to a wider, softer edge, or the paintbrush for strokes that are typically a softer brush with a wider size. But again, whether you're using the pencil, the brush, the eraser, or the ink tool, you get control over the brush size and the brush shape. We have similar options in Photoshop. If you select the brush, you can choose the brush tool, the pencil tool. Not only can you choose the brush size, but you can also determine whether it's a hard or soft edge. Again, this works for the brush, the pencil, the eraser. All of these can be set between hardness and size. Let's talk about some touch-up tools and start with smudge in GIMP. Right here is the smudge tool. I really don't like this fire extinguisher being in the picture. I'm going to make this a larger brush, nice hard edge, and I'm going to pull color from on top of the fire extinguisher down over it. So I'm pulling color using the smudge tool to get rid of that fire extinguisher. Dodge and burn in GIMP. You may notice that this wood is a little lighter here than it is over here. By choosing the dodge and burn tool, you may have to slide down to choose between the two. Dodge means add light, such as when it was being developed in a dark room. More light means it's brighter. Burn, on the other hand, will make something darker. Using my rectangular selection tool, I could select that section of railing, and then with my burn tool, I could darken that wood up. So dodge will make an area you have selected lighter or brighter, and burn will make an area you have selected darker. We can also choose sharpen or blur. We can sharpen this part of the image up if the resolution wasn't as good as we would have liked when we started. Choose the blur or sharpen. In this case, I'll choose sharpen. And just add a little more detail to that image. Red eye removal in GIMP. In GIMP, you would go to the red eye removal filter, which is under Filters, Enhance, Red eye removal. In Photoshop, the tools work almost exactly the same way. We just need to find those tools. In Photoshop, if you press and hold here, you'll see the blur tool, the sharpen tool, and the smudge tool occupy the same space. If you click here, you'll see that the dodge and burn tool occupy the same space. If you select here, you'll notice the red eye removal tool is on the healing tool space. Choose the red eye removal tool, click on the eye, and it will automatically correct it. What you do is up to you.